What's going on YouTube? Levi of Old Iron Off-Road. Today we're going to be digging into the Holley Sniper systems. Is it 100% plug and play? Is it really self-learning? Is it just plug it in, forget it? Spoiler alert, I would be willing to bet at this point that if all you've done is loaded the Wizard out of the 3.5-inch handheld, and that's the bare minimum that you've done, I would almost say that you are probably experiencing some kind of issue, possibly a cold start issue, a hot start issue, maybe low power at higher RPMs under wide open throttle. Before I dive too deep into this, I do want to make sure that I just right out of the gate say that I'm extremely impressed with the Sniper system and the software that is available for free when you purchase the system. So without further ado, let's dig into it. So throughout the years, we've been asked multiple times what kind of fuel injection system that we typically run. And I don't think it's been any secret that up until recently, we have been running the GM TBI based fuel injection systems, specifically from Hamilton Fuel Injection. We've ran fuel injection systems from Affordable Fuel Injection. Hal also has some stuff available, but I don't think Hal does timing control. And honestly, timing control was one of those things that I felt was very important with the fuel injection systems, as far as not having to, it was already part of the system, you didn't have to add it on. Now, the Sniper system that we'll be discussing today is fuel only, but in the future, I definitely think that adding timing control is going to be something that we are going to dig into. We're not going to talk too much about that today. So the reason for the Holley Sniper system, it was basically just to get some knowledge for it. So the reason we were a little apprehensive in the beginning to install either the Phytech or the Holley Sniper or anything similar was just because we felt like it was kind of new, and the customer service on like the Phytech end just didn't seem like it was great. Now, from what I understand, Holley has a lot better customer service. And also the knowledge base and wealth of knowledge has grown significantly. There's a lot of tuning videos. Joe Simpson is actually somebody that you're going to want to check out as well. I'm going to leave a link to his channel down in the description. Make sure if you're digging into your Holley Sniper setup, you're going to want to check out his videos. Now, most of what he does is Terminator and Dominator, but it all applies. It all crosses over. Again, that's kind of where we ended up. And now I wanted to get a real world feel. I wanted to be more educated. When people ask me my thoughts on the Sniper, I wanted to be able to say yay or nay. And I will go ahead and say that I am thoroughly impressed again with the software. I'm thoroughly impressed with the system. It does seem to function well. The next thing that is going to lead me to, is the system truly self-tuning? And in my mind, I'm going to say not really. I mean, it kind of is. And I think that's a little misleading from a purchasing aspect. People are going to buy this thinking that it is a 100% plug and play system. Now, what it does tune is it basically takes a list of set parameters that you input from the Wizard, like you tell it your engine size, how many cylinders, what kind of ignition control you're running. It spits out a base volumetric efficiency table and a base fuel table based on what you tell it, and then it begins to correct the fuel table from there. That aspect of it is reasonably self-tuning. Now, could you go in and tune it yourself and on a dyno and make it better? Absolutely. Now, the other aspects of the system that we're going to dig into, I'm actually going to go into a screen record mode. I'm going to show you one of the early tables that the Wizard spit out versus where we actually ended up. So right out of the box, we had a really hard cold start issue. The truck did not want a cold start. It would actually take 2 or 3 key cycles to get it to fire. Just due to the initial pump shot, I think was what was helping that. And warm start was good, idle was reasonably good, and we actually ended up having some power loss on wide open throttle that we had to dial in. We'll dig into that when we go into the screen record mode. But I think that's the biggest thing that I wanted to touch on at this point, is that the system is self-learning as far as the actual fuel table goes, but you need to transfer that to the base, and there's some other steps that you need to do. And there's also the comp correction, the closed loop correction, and the learn correction that needs to be changed as well after you've let it learn and get its addition or subtraction of fuel dialed in closer to a normal range, you need to limit what the computer is able to add or remove. Otherwise, you could potentially have some issues later on down the road. Again, we'll cover that when we go into split screen mode. So I think we'll jump over into the software. I think for me, the big thing is if you're not taking advantage of this, again, I think you're sorely missing out. And there's so many functions that you can take advantage of. If you're not doing that, again, I think that you're missing out on a huge part of the software. So I'll quit rambling, and we're going to try to be concise and to the point on this. I also want to include at this point in time that I am a novice myself. Like, this isn't something that I know a whole lot about. Obviously, I've watched some videos and I've learned quite a bit. And I will say also that right out of the box, I was very hopeful that this was going to be exactly what it was kind of marketed as. You know, plug it up and forget it. But you know, with the cold start issues that we were having, unfortunately, that forced me to, or fortunately, however you want to dig into it, forced my hand to buckle down and learn a little bit more than maybe I even initially wanted to. But now here we are. So again, without further ado, let's jump over into screen record mode. I'm going to walk through some basic functions and parameters that you may want to take advantage of. And doing it on the 3.5-inch handheld is not really realistic. They are accessible, but they're fiddly, and I believe you would probably cause some issues if you did try to adjust them from there. So let's jump into it. So this is one of the early config files that we first started with right out of the wizard. Now we're going to take you over to the fuel table. And one of the first things I want you to notice is, even though we're running only a 345 engine, keep in mind the wizard is already ran. This is kind of what it spit out. It's showing a 7,000 RPM swing, and that's really not realistic. Now, the engine is only going to function in this range, but it just populates a lot of unnecessary data in this range. And if you want to dial that down to a more usable area, as you can see, I just input 4,500 and it automatically populated it out. It's going to get you a lot more resolution in that area. Now, another thing that you're going to take a look at now too is going to be the volumetric efficiency. Now, just based on that RPM range, on the 7,000 RPM range, it spit out a volumetric efficiency number up here in the top end of the throttle area of 120%. That's also pretty unrealistic. Now, again, any of this is kind of, it's important, but it's not a big deal. Your engine's only going to operate within the area that it's going to operate in, and then it will correct in that specific area. But again, I think it's kind of more important to get it dialed in to get a tighter resolution and get an actual picture of what the engine actually is using and what it needs. So I'm going to jump over to the target air fuel ratio. Now, one of the things that the laptop enables is you to see a 2D table of your target air fuel ratio. Now, again, this was the first one that was input or an output of the wizard. I'm not really sure if I actually told it the target air fuel. I think it populates it itself. You can see here at the wide open throttle range, we were at 12.5. Now again, the computer doesn't know if that's what your engine really needs. It's making a pretty broad assumption that 12.5 under wide open throttle is actually what your engine wants, as well as 13 at idle and 14 at cruise. Now, these are probably pretty safe numbers, but again, it's just an assumption. And seat of the pants and the dyno, what would actually determine where these numbers really need to be. So in our situation, we noticed that we had a really, really weak low power feel under wide open throttle, under load. So we actually had to play around with the target AFR in that range because, again, due to low power. We tried leaning it out. We actually tried a 12.7. And that seemed to make it worse, so we actually ended up going the other way. We dialed in around 12.2, which is actually a little fat, but again, each engine is going to require its own thing. And that seemed to pep it right up, and no longer do we experience like a loss of power under wide open throttle. So that was something that we had to adjust. Now, I'm going to open the other config file. Here we are today. This is actually what we're running. You can see this is our volumetric efficiency table. On the upper end here is 100%. We've got 4,500 RPM. We've got our map and PSI. And you can honestly see that even with all of this extra data, realistically our engine is only running, rarely are we ever going to see 4,000 RPM in a Scout. I mean, you could see past that, but you know, every valve in the engine is going to float. Things are going to be unhappy. So as a general rule, we're running right in this area from here. We're running in this range, somewhere in here. I mean, we might even creep up into here if we're really, really silly. And this is going to depend on atmospheric pressure, how far above sea level you are. That's a story for another day, so we're really not going to get into that. The two areas that we had issues with, and this is something that, again, the computer can't necessarily compensate for. The only thing the computer does is it populates this base fuel table, the fuel graph, and it will also populate this learn table. Now, we don't currently have any data on the learn table. Our learn table got to where it was tight enough that on the last transfer that the computer was barely making any correction. So we've got that pretty squared away. Now, that is one other thing that I'm going to discuss real quick, is if your computer is no longer making large swings, if you're only seeing, like, which you should, if you're seeing a 50 or if you're seeing anything over about a 20% correction, obviously you have an issue. Now, the closed loop compensation limits are set on the computer to 100%, meaning the computer can add or remove 100% of fuel. As this thing learns and as it gets itself dialed in, you're definitely going to want to go back and limit that, because if you had an O2 sensor failure, for one, it's going to wreck your learn table, and also it's going to end up leaving you sitting on the side of the road, because it's going to either add or pull a ton of fuel depending on failure mode of the O2 sensor. Or if it goes to the rich side, it's going to lean it out. If it goes to the lean side, it's going to enrich in the fuel. And it's going to literally try to add or remove 100% of fuel. So these are definitely something that you're going to want to limit that. You're going to want to 100% dial that back. As a matter of fact, we've got ours dialed in close enough that I think that I'm going to pull this back to 20% on the learn and the closed loop compensation parameters. This is even mentioned in the big Holley manual, so definitely something that you're going to want to pay attention to. One of the things that we had an issue with was the wide open throttle, and as you can see here, this is where we dropped our air fuel ratio at wide open throttle to 12.2. And then another issue we had was the cold start. There are a couple different tools that will allow you to enrich in the mixture during cranking and even after cranking, to keep the engine running and get it to its target air fuel ratio and its target idle. So I'm going to show you this as well. So in the idle speed settings, you can see here that you have various idle speeds based on coolant temperature range. And again, this is where we had our biggest issue. There are a couple of tools that will help you get the startup dialed in. Now, one thing you have is you have this fuel prime percentage, and I want to use kind of a word of caution there when adjusting that. First thing you want to do is you want to make sure that the engine starts warm and idles well. Now, if you have an engine that doesn't cold start but it warm starts well, and you just throw a ton of fuel prime at it, you could potentially hurt the warm up, because that extra shot of fuel might be too much for it once the engine is warm. So again, I suggest making sure that once you adjust your temperature or your fuel prime percentage up, you want to make sure you do it while the engine is warm and it is happy with it while the engine is warm. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to show a quick reference between the two tables, just so you get an idea of how far off we were. Now again, this is something that the computer can't compensate for. The computer doesn't make any of these adjustments or corrections for you. So you can see here in the early file, we started out with 100%, which is what it's initially set at. But what you're going to want to take a look at is the different means of enrichment as far as startup. And you also have temperature enrichment, which is a percentage of fuel based on coolant temp. So 100% is actually 0. That's what the base fuel table wants. It's not adding or subtracting anything. And then once you get colder, you can see that you're actually adding, there is 110, you're actually adding 10% fuel, 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%, so on and so forth. Now the startup enrichment is a little different. It references cranking fuel in pounds per hour, but you can see where these values are at. And here at 160 degrees, we were at 18.6. Now our engine was pretty happy anywhere from 120 to 180 degrees. The cranking fuel was pretty spot on, so we really didn't have to adjust that too much. But you can see here that throughout some of the other ranges that we had to pull quite a bit of fuel, or actually I'm sorry, we had to add quite a bit of fuel. So at 120 degrees, we were at 28 pounds per hour. And here we ended up 120 degrees at 35 pounds per hour. 80 degrees, we ended up at 46 pounds per hour, where at 80 degrees, we were only at 39 pounds per hour. So we had to add quite a bit of fuel during startup or during cranking. Now, once the computer stops seeing cranking RPM, it's going to refer back to temperature enrichment. And across the board, we had to add quite a bit of fuel percent and the coolant temp enrichment. And another thing that you're going to want to look at too is going to be the air-fuel ratio offset. And that is what the computer is trying to refer to as a target air-fuel ratio based on coolant temp. So if at idle, your normal air-fuel ratio is 13, which ours is, we're actually adding a percentage of that to the calculated value. So it's actually targeting at 40 degrees, it's actually pulling 1.7 or adding 1.7 of an air-fuel ratio. So that's pulling the air-fuel ratio down to it's actually trying to get it down to 12.3 at that temp, and then so on and so forth. So we did adjust these values, and the coolant temp enrichment, we had to throw fuel in it there, all to net us a better starting engine. So those are the steps that we took to correct our issues. And again, those changes could probably be made on the 3.5-inch handheld, but it wouldn't be very fun. It would be super fiddly, and it really wouldn't be an ideal situation. So that's why I'm going to say that if you have the system and you haven't gotten a cable and gotten a computer hooked up to it to make any changes, you're doing yourself a huge disservice. And again, where I'm going to say that, is the system 100% self-tuning? Not really. If you're picky like me and you don't want quirky issues, there's definitely some work that can be done to the system. Now, probably maybe 20% of people, maybe 100% of people, maybe I'm an anomaly, I seriously doubt it. But I would say that more often than not, there's going to be some changes that need to be made to get the system dialed in perfectly. Overall thoughts on the system, I think it's great. Or the software that's available for free with the system, I think it's great. So far, the system seems to be working flawlessly. We've got everything pretty much dialed in where we want it. We're super happy with it. I'm absolutely going to install another one, and honestly, I'm looking forward into digging in and learning more about what the system is actually capable of and building up my knowledge and skills as far as making the appropriate adjustments when they need to be made. So I hope I've done a good job of explaining my position on the Holley Sniper system and how I see it. I actually look forward to viewing your comments and your responses below, so make sure you do leave us some comments and your thoughts and opinions as well. Again, this isn't intended to be a how-to, more of a look into what we have learned so far on this system. So I think that's all we've got for this video. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and as always, enjoy.